So as you can see, we are diving today into the stupid, weird, amazing history of comics because there's no better, more accurate description for it. So with that being said, let's get started. So like anything else, a comic has to have an origin story. There's always got to be a start somewhere, so where did comics start? It's first off the most crazy, debatable, silly discussion in the world. Everybody's got a different opinion on it, but I like to start with art and narrative first and foremost. So you've got things like cave paintings, you've got hieroglyphics, triumphal columns, and what all these things have in common is that they're recording history, but also they're telling someone a story. They're saying, hey, check out this sick buffalo hunt, or this king was totally rad, the gods are angry at us, etc. So strictly speaking, no, they're not comics, but the idea of visual storytelling has been established very, very early on in history. You even start seeing some stuff like literary themes, and that develops all the way into things like political satire against your opponents, against the regime of the time, and so on. So comic historians will argue forever and ever about it, but the most common consensus is that the earliest known comic, as we know what comics look like today, is called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, and that's from 1837. Yes, that name is totally amazing, and I want it. But even cooler, this book was actually a rom-com. It's all about this guy, Obadiah Oldbuck, who is looking to impress his lady love with shenanigans, and it's completely hilarious. It's kind of a like morbid, old English hilarious where there's literally a part in this book where he thinks he's dead for like 84 hours until he gets hungry and decides like, all right, I guess I'll get up and like make a sandwich and go find my girlfriend again to flirt with her. That's literally the humor of these kinds of books. So take it with a grain of salt. Anyway, that is going to lead us into different eras of comics, which collectors use the different age of comics to classify the year a comic came out, the scarcity of it, all that jazz. First up, we've got the Platinum Age. This era lasts from around 1897, runs up to 1937, and you've got titles like Famous Funnies, Buck Rogers, Little Orphan Annie, some classics that a few people know leading the charge. Most of the original comics in history were going to be humorous or satirical in nature. A lot of them were geared towards kids, so it's as funny as those jokes could be around then. Again, quoting the morbid Obadiah Oldbuck comic as an example. Funny used to mean be like fatally dangerous nonsense for the purpose of very small victories. So, you know, A for ambition. I'm totally with them on that. But really, all around the world, other creators were also getting ambitious. Hokusai was creating manga in Japan in early 18th century. Hergé had Tintin's Adventures in France. There were Penny Dreadfuls, which were very popular, like horror comics and shows in Britain, and so on and so forth. So while comics kind of started as a functioning art, kind of in the same way fashion and sculpture and artisan work did, they evolved into stories that you take lessons from, stories that relate us to one another, relate us to our past, to essentially share what we've been through and share that human experience. But most of all, comics turned into something fun. They showed us these far-off worlds and crazy monsters, and then as we moved into the 1930s, they showed us superheroes. These were the men that could fly. They were aliens with super strength. They were detectives with bat gadgets and sentinels of liberty. And 1938 specifically brought us into the golden age of comics, where some of our favorite heroes that we know today actually came to life. Perfect example of that, Superman, created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. He was basically the one that started the whole superhero craze that never ended up stopping. Kids wanted to now start reading more characters fighting crime, kind of like the old detective comics did, but they wanted them achieving the impossible too. So these readers became completely enamored by things like the Fantastic Four, Wonder Woman, Captain America, and as superheroes started pushing comic sales up, more and more heroes started getting created. Unfortunately, some of that came to a very abrupt stop because you had World War II suddenly happening, which was a huge tragedy in our history. It spanned more than 6 years. And while American involvement helped to achieve peace in some ways, it also caused a lot of suffering in others. The war efforts ended up requiring a lot of recycled paper, and comics were the easiest targets to be trashed and repurposed. So that's what a lot of that paper went towards. A lot of those old gems like Superman's first appearance in Action Comics #1, just for reference, worth between $100,000 and $5 million. From worst to best condition, a lot of those old gems were lost. And fun fact for Action Comics, there's only 50 to 100 known copies still existing in the world of that comic. So it kind of puts into perspective just why it's so expensive. That being said, check your attics, check your basements. If you've got it, let us know. So on top of the war, there was also a new government regulation that was introduced to censor the content of comics, vastly limiting what could actually be published, and unfortunately a lot of those old books that didn't make the cut and didn't follow those guidelines ended up having to be collected and burned by the same kids that bought them and loved them in the first place. And this was known as the Comics Code Authority. A lot of comics were, the new ones that were made were used in promotion of the Allied forces for the war. And even after it ended, some of those stories continued being printed about the Army and their families, though there were a few authors that were brave enough to actually challenge the events of World War II. Japanese art and manga in particular evolved kind of following Hiroshima's unfortunate destruction. So as the world healed as best it could, both Marvel and DC Comics moved forward, and they had a huge revitalization of their lines of heroes, which leads us into the Silver Age. So the Silver Age took place between 1956 and 1970. In those years, pretty much all the superheroes that you know and the stories that they have, all those stories formed from the Silver Age comics. 1968 especially was an important year as a ton of new solo books launched. And just to put that into perspective, this is like Marvel and DC and a few other people. These were all the comics that got a new run in 1968, or at least most of them. The Atom, Batlash, Creeper, Captain America, Captain Marvel, Captain Savage, Checkered Demon, Cobalt 60, Cubitus, Doctor Strange, Fish Boy, Ghost Manor, Hawk and Dove, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, Lockhorns, Luther, Max Magnus, Nick Fury, Phantom Eagle, Secret Six, Silver Surfer, Spearman, Spectacular Spider-Man, Submariner, Tiger, Trashman, Twinkle, The Unexpected, Vader and Zune, Disney Digest, Yellow Dog, and like a billion more. So one of the biggest accomplishments of the Silver Age was the broadened reach of comics to all ages, and the start of reaching out to female readership as well. You also had the introduction and development of more relatable characters, more real characters, best example of that being Spider-Man. Everybody knows who Spider-Man is, but the key fact here is that everyone also knows who Peter Parker is. He's a high school student seeking his way through his own life, and this great power is thrust upon him, and he went with it. He made light of it, he challenged it, he suffered through it. He was a real kid, and his message was essentially reaching readers in a way that suddenly fans of comics became fans of characters and their stories specifically, just as much as they loved like all the crime fighting adventure stuff. So After that happened, readership started growing, comics were published for more audiences, and then you had a little bit more stirring beneath the surface. In the 1970s, the notion of small press and specifically adult publications came to public fruition. So these things had always been around, but they were largely kept in secret. You had a lot of copyright error stuff that you could get into a lot of legal trouble with. But with the new renaissance of counterculture working against and challenging the Comics Code Authority, satirical comics and zines, like all that stuff came to flourish, and it kind of poked fun at the industry itself. A lot of them ended up being published and actually sold right along the side of regular comics. If the name Robert Crumb sounds familiar to you, his work was a huge part of this era, and in terms of like the style of publication, huge influence. Also, if you've heard that his stuff is weird, that is completely accurate. But a lot of the weird of the 1970s also spurred another movement in comics that leads us into the Bronze Age, which lasts from around 1970 to 1985. In this period of comics history, you're seeing a gradual fluctuation in the kinds of stories that superhero books are looking to tell. So the US Department of Health, Education, and Welfare actually approached Marvel to publish a story about the dangers of substance abuse and drugs, which, you know, it's awesome that they commissioned them, but the problem is that every single one of those subjects was vehemently banned by the Comics Code Authority. So Marvel basically went whatever and published their story anyway, a 3-issue run of Spider-Man that talked about the dangers of drug abuse. And even further than that, you had comics that were diversifying to showcase more superheroines, more heroes of color, and an interesting mix of titles that actually catered to different age groups and genre enthusiasts. So you had the return of horror comics, the return of sci-fi comics, you had romance comics everywhere, you had war stories, you had a huge selection of stuff, almost rivaling the selection that you see in comic shops today. Also around this time, there was a significant increase in newspaper comic strips, whether that was political satire or kids' funnies or reprints of the classics like Peanuts and Dick Tracy. And then you also had new ones as well, like Calvin and Hobbes. So if you are a Western comic fan and you have not read any comic strips before, stuff like this, live the dream and read some, because there are some amazing books out there that have a surprising amount of heart and depth, like, you know, your typical comic would. So moving right along, another really important part of the Bronze Age, and will also lead us into the modern age, is the ascension of dark comics. Probably all titles you have seen or at least heard of. This is like Watchmen, Sandman, Batman the Killing Joke, et cetera, et cetera. Basically around this time, the creator angst dial was maxed, but some amazing concepts and stories were the result of that. So you had things like questioning who polices superheroes, what created the madness in the Joker in the first place, and so on and so forth. My top 3 recommended reads from that time period, you can actually see up here. You've got Batman Arkham Asylum, Watchmen, and From Hell. The only thing I would say is just kind of be ready to have a sort of sad, disillusioned day or two worth after reading these books, but trust me, they're very good. Okay, now we come to a culmination of all of this, which is the modern age. And it's recent history, but there's actually a lot of really rich recent history with comics. So let's take a look at a little bit of the 80s, late 80s and early 90s. I will preface this and say that very few comics from this era are worth a lot of money, just to save you guys some heartbreak. The Death of Superman sells for $3 to $7 on average. I know, I'm so sorry. But hey, we had some fun at the start of this era. Look at all those pouches. That's a lot of pouches that you can carry Legos and cell phones and things with you at all times, whatever's cool these days. I'm like almost 30, so I don't follow any of that. So in the 90s, there was a major event that a lot of comic fans called the Exodus. And what happened was there was a shared frustration by some of the major creators or creators of the time at Marvel and some of DC, and they didn't like their work for hire policies. Essentially, they weren't really rewarding the talent that was driving their business and making them all their money. So these creators got together and left the big publishers to start their own, which was kind of unheard of because most small publishers were barely making it if they were out there. But these names, the reason why these names were even known was because of their work for major publishers. So they started their own, which was Image Comics, where the creators owned their work and created it without interference from other creators within that imprint. So these guys were Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Jim Valentino, Mark Silvestri, and Rob Liefeld. Again, some of those names you might recognize, but up here there's a title from each of them that, like Spawn you might know, Shadowhawk possibly. So together these guys created comics in their own individual imprints within Image Comics, and they spurred this craze for a collector, secondary market, which is arguably the beginning of one of the worst time periods in comic history. In 1996, the Great Comics Crash occurred. This was due in part to a few different factors, most of it being the rise of the direct market distribution and new pop-up comic shops, paired with this comic collecting boom that very suddenly deteriorated the value of comics that people purchased in bulk, thinking it was going to be an investment. But shops also ended up over-ordering these books because they were promised to be collectible. So the whole point of books being collectible is because they're rare and they're hard to get. And when they started Image and started this initiative of printing, 1 million copies at a time of these books, everyone banked on these creators and spent tons of money getting it initially. Then everyone tried to sell their valuables all at once. The market bottomed out, and it resulted not only in collectors and customers being completely jaded and kind of leaving the industry, but it resulted in shops closing day in and out. The straw that kind of broke the camel's back on all of that was in 1997, Marvel Comics filed for bankruptcy, which is kind of hard to imagine considering their recent $52.4 billion assets buyout. It's hard to imagine Marvel going under at any point in time, but they did. There were a few little saving graces, though, that kind of helped keep the few survivors of that crash holding out through the years. First off, the idea of webcomics revolutionized the way that you developed a fan base and targeted readership as an independent creator. So you had comics posted online like Penny Arcade, Netboy, Sluggy Freelance, and so on, that they were comics that were largely inspired by the internet and technology's advances by itself, but you also had a good chunk of these influenced by this giant anime boom that happened in the States. Anime was on a crazy rise. They brought award-winning films over, ongoing series, video game franchises, Japanese manga, all of this stuff into the Western world where fans just ate it up. You had comic geeks, you had gamers, you had completely new readers coming in to check this stuff out just for the style of it. There's pretty much no 90s kid out there who will be unaware of Pokemon or Dragon Ball Z, nor will their parents at least not for Pokemon. They will not have not heard of it. Pokemon Go kind of helped that too. Thanks, Japan. So the next big part of rebuilding the comics industry was the resurgence of comic book films, which released over the span of a few years, slowly but surely kind of pulling old readers back and collectors back in. And but the other thing it did is that, kind of like anime and manga, it invited new readers to come in and check out these stories. You had a bunch of animated kid shows that were stupid popular, Batman Adventures, the X-Men, Spider-Man, and more. But then Sam Raimi's live-action film Spider-Man came out. Bryan Singer's X-Men came out just a few years prior to that. So you had all these things coming out, and then we were shown what shared cinematic universes could be. So Marvel's Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor took pretty big risks, and with Disney buying Marvel out dirt cheap, they were able to throw a lot of their other investment into linking all these films together, which led up to the Avengers. Even DC kind of jumped in on this later on with Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, Wonder Woman, and then they led that up to Justice League. So the question now is, where are comics today? What's 2018 looking like for the industry? There's a constant state of fluctuation in terms of the economy, but all the comic publishers and imprints out there are not looking to slow down for anything. You've got tons and tons of events, tons of new series starting. Essentially, if you like to read even the slightest, there's going to be a comic book for you. So I would say right now, the biggest events going on in comics would be Doomsday Clock, which is a marriage of the DC universe and the Watchmen's universe. And then there's also Avengers No Surrender, which is a weekly release. Basically another big Marvel event where it's all the good guys versus all the bad guys. DC also very recently launched an imprint of comics called Young Animals with Gerard Way. And yes, that is singer Gerard Way, My Chemical Romance. Actually a fantastic writer. And the series have all been phenomenal. So now what they're going to be doing is they just started this event where they're tying those books and those characters into the DC universe in some really weird, cool ways. It sounds very strange, but the event is called Milk Wars. Trust me, pick up these books if you can find them. It is a great start to this series that's going to be coming out throughout this year. Marvel also just announced 2 new upcoming books that you can subscribe to. There's The Hunt for Wolverine and Venomized. If you want to know more about how to subscribe to comics and be a part of supporting your local comic shops, which is a huge part of keeping this industry going, you can come see me after the panel. I'll be over at Chimera's Comics, still talking too much about comics all day because that's what I like to do. So last but not least, for those of you who are super into the comic movies and you're kind of curious to try some comics but you're not sure where to start, this is a little series that I call Watch This, Read This. So for example, Black Panther is going to be coming out this month. Very, very exciting. If you enjoy Black Panther, or if you're planning to see the Black Panther movie, check out this comic called Rise of the Black Panther. It's essentially a year 1 story where Wakanda is first revealed to the world because they've been kept in secret for so long. It's issue 1 just came out, and it's off to this phenomenal start. I want to say it's a 12-issue miniseries. It's very good. Walking Dead Season 8 is either currently out or about to be out. And Walking Dead, the comic, just started a new story arc called New World Order. So that is totally worth checking out. The big thing we're leading up to, of course, is Avengers Infinity War, which everyone and their grandma is going to go see, and that's awesome. So if you're excited for that, check out Infinity Countdown, which starts February 21st. And finally, later this year, we're going to have Aquaman coming out, which for Aquaman, there's going to be a new series February 28th called Mera, Queen of Atlantis, and it looks every bit of amazing as that image suggests. And then, and just a few upcoming comics for those who are already into comics as well. So now that the 13th Doctor has just regenerated into who she is, they're actually going to be starting a completely new line of comics for all the Doctors of Doctor Who. You can subscribe to any one of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them. So that's awesome. X-Men Red is a new series that's going to be launching February 7th, which is next week, now that I think about what time zone I'm in. So that launches next week, which is awesome. It's a new story with a classic X-Men team. Deathstroke versus Batman is going to be a mini-series in April, which sounds amazing. Sonic the Hedgehog is relaunching for a good kids title with IDW around the same time. And then finally, there's a series called Isola from Image Comics that starts April 4th. If you like anime or manga, if you're into Miyazaki's works, this comic is heavily inspired by that, so it's probably going to be also amazing. But lastly, I just wanted to say thank you guys for dropping by here early to come and listen to me blab about comics. But in the end, welcome to Lyon Con. Have an amazing show. Check out the vendors. We've got gaming stuff going on all day. And just have fun today. Thank you.